Thank you. I want to talk to you today about cities. Cities are a wonderful thing. It's a place where people can realize their potential. I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in South Brooklyn. If you can imagine this, there's a place in Brooklyn that is not yet hip, and that's where I was born. I was born in Brownsville, grew up in Coney Island, Bensonhurst, and that's a place that does not yet have artisanal pickles. It does not have little chocolate factories. But it's a wondrous place. And Brooklyn, over the last 10, 15 years, has seen a complete renaissance, a place where people can come to realize their potential. People are starting businesses. People are starting restaurants. People are starting food businesses, all kinds of new areas of arts and culture. New galleries are opening up. Artists are opening up studio spaces. People are opening up their homes to all kinds of salons and music. It's a place of wondrous renaissance. And so, how do we think about cities? How do we imagine cities? How do we imagine cities as places where each of us can realize our potential? That's what I want to talk to you about today. We'll talk about just a few areas of cities, how we live and work, how we think about starting new companies and entrepreneurship, and then how we educate the young and ourselves. So let's start on this journey. When we think about cities, we think about places that people come to from all over the place to find opportunity. When John Harrison, for example, back in the 1700s, wanted to solve the longitudinal prize. There was a prize at that time by Queen Anne. She said, anyone who can solve the problem of figuring out longitude at sea to save all the sailors and save all these ships will get a huge sum of money. And John Harrison, a clockmaker from the countryside, came to the city of London and said, I think I can do it. And spent his next 50 years in the city of London to try to make that happen, and he did. And he opened up a revolution in terms of navigating the seas. And he did that in the city. Let's think about other people who changed the world. Da Vinci. Da Vinci is somebody who started in the countryside. Here's his house in the countryside, and he realized as he grew up, he needed to come to the city to realize his potential. He's somebody who crossed all kinds of boundaries. He's somebody who went to a number of cities. Bologna, Rome, Florence. He flourished in these cities. He came to these cities for the patronage of the arts that he was able to get, and also for the contracts, building new kinds of devices, new kinds of inventions to help the cities that were his patrons. So now let's think about our cities. Let's think about the cities now of today and how we can take them to the future. Let's go back first to the 30s and 40s. Here was the workplace. So you have an open plan, but basically everyone here is working in the same kind of role, the same kind of task. Not a lot of collaboration, not a lot of cross-functionality. Let's fast forward a little bit to the cubicle era. What a wonderful time that was. So neat and tidy. Any psychologist would recognize this from a rat experiment, sure? And so now let's turn to today. Open, collaborative spaces, co-working spaces, shared spaces, spaces that small companies can flourish in, spaces that you don't need to take a 5 or 10-year lease, spaces that you can come, swipe a quick credit card, and you're up and running, spaces that you can come, bring your small teams, work in collaboration together, and build new opportunities, unleash your potential, unleash all kinds of ideas very, very quickly. The problem back in Da Vinci's time is that people like Da Vinci, Bach, Beethoven, folks like that, these exemplars, these wondrous personalities and wondrous talents, they did unleash their potential in the cities. But most people at that time in the cities were not doing so. Most people were kind of stuck in whatever they were doing. But now we have the opportunity to extend this ability to unleash potential to everyone living in the cities. These are some of the structures. When we think about user interface, often we think about telephones, phones, our mobile phones, and what kind of user interface would that have, or a laptop. But cities have user interfaces as well. And architecture, design, and office space like this is inherent to the user interface of a city. This is inherent to the interface and design of how we interact with each other. So now let's move to another area, the larger office park, the larger office space. The new kinds of designs are not meant to actually put people in separate areas, but to encourage collisions, serendipity. When we think now about how ideas come about, how we unleash our potential with different ideas, we want people to actually collide with each other. We want that serendipitous collision to happen. And more companies are realizing that. On the next slide, this is actually an image from Zappos. The new headquarters of Zappos is designed not to have people apart, but to have people funnel through at lunchtime, on exit, at entry, all funnel through so they collide with each other, so they connect with each other. So different ideas from different disciplines, different departments, all come together. This is the workplace of the future. This is the user interface of the future when we think about our cities and our workplaces. Now let's think about, okay, you have an idea. You have an idea for a new project, a new film, a new creative project, a new company, whatever really whatever is there to realize your potential. Well, the old way of doing things is going to the bank. You go to the bank, and the bank's supposed to be the place where you get the funding for those kinds of projects. But is that really the case today? Not really. The banks are captive of a system that actually averts risk, that actually wants to avoid risk and not engage in risk. So the banks have become outdated. And so what has replaced that? Crowdfunding, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, all the new kinds of crowdfunding, angel funding, the rise of the super angel, individuals giving out $50,000, $100,000 to get dozens and dozens of companies started. New kinds of ways of offering creative projects, again, via crowdfunding, via new kinds of potential funding mechanisms, via the Jobs Act. All these different things are going to start new creative projects, helping each of us to realize our potential. So if the bank and the retail branch is not the case, is not the answer, what is? Well, right here we see banking going on. We see mentorship in microfinance. Microfinance is a tremendous potential for funding all kinds of projects and companies. But microfinance doesn't happen at a branch. There's no microfinance branch right now in New York City, yet thousands of companies are starting in New York right now and other cities around the world using microfinance. So we have to rethink our interface. We have to rethink how we engage in financing. Maybe it's a coffee shop that's the new bank. Maybe it's just a mobile phone. Maybe it's this third place that becomes the bank of the future. How do we think about engaging in those areas? In some countries, on the next slide, you see this is a bank right here, part of a community center. And so we embed banking now amongst other services. Maybe banking is not a solitary fact. Maybe it's not a solitary function. Maybe it gets embedded in the social network. And so the social network itself becomes the best way to get access to the funding you need to realize your potential. Because who better than your social network to realize the ability for you to repay that loan? And so that's what's happening right now across the world. The traditional way of scoring credit has been with Fair Isaac, has been with all kinds of formulas, looking at your past history and things like that. But the new way is to say, wait a second, a huge number of people in the world are not part of the banking system. They're not banked right now. How can we get them into the banking system? Instead of the old interfaces of retail branches and formulas, we're looking at social networks and community centers, people who know you. And the people who know you can vouch for you and say, this is a person we can trust. This is a person we can believe in. This is a person we can bank with. This is a person we can fund their project, their creative project, their business. And so we bring them into the system in a different way, in a non-traditional way. This is part of the city of the future. Not just traditional banking, but ways of helping each person, those with credit history, but particularly those without credit history, engage and help them realize their potential. They don't necessarily have to work for a large company anymore or for a fast food joint. They can now start their own company. This is part of the city of the future. Let's now turn to education. Here we see modern day education. Essentially, it hasn't changed, right? Many of our schools right now, many of our schools across the country look exactly like this. Rows and rows and rows of desks, students lined up, moving on to college even, sitting there crammed in. Now, it does look a little bit different now with lots of laptops, but still is that fundamentally different? That's still basically the lecture mode. That's still basically a mode of kids in K through 12 or adults coming to college and listening for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. But is that actually the best way to educate in the cities of the future? Is that the best way to help each of us unleash our potential? We think there's probably a better way now. Let's take a look. Here are kids collaborating. They're solving a problem together. Here's the teacher of today and the future. What's the teacher of today's role? Instead of being a lecturer, they now become a coach and facilitator. So as kids and students are working in teams together, as they're working together to solve problems, the teacher can check in with each team, become a collaborator with them, become a facilitator, become a coach. That's the new role of the teacher. That's a role that's a wonderful role. It's a role that the teacher wants to embrace. And it's a role that takes us away from the models that we saw before. It's also a role that helps prepare the student for the kind of jobs of today and tomorrow. The kind of jobs we have today are not about taking tests, are not about memorizing. The kind of jobs we have today in today's economy are about collaboration, are about solving problems. These are the kind of jobs we have today. Well, let's have schools. Let's have educational areas. Let's have schools, both formal and informal, that help prepare us for this kind of future. Here is a classroom. This is a classroom. This is a classroom where kids are collaborating to create robots. Robots that will fight each other. Actually, they're going to play soccer against each other. But the fact is that we can reimagine how we have our schooling system so that we actually are compatible with unleashing the potential of each person. We're not preparing kids anymore for the kind of 1940s workplace that you saw before. We are preparing, and we want to prepare kids for the kind of workplace we have today, the sharing workplace, the collaborative workplace. These are the kind of workplaces that make sense for today to unleash each of our potentials. So let's have schools that actually marry that. And that, by the way, it doesn't have to just be formal schools like you see over here, where they're creating robots in the school. To the next slide, we see Maker Faire. Maker Faire is a wonderful idea that brings together adults and kids working in collaboration outside of a formal school setting. And so schooling and education does not have to be limited to the four walls of a physical school building. We can now go beyond that. So when we think about now the city of the future, when we think about the city that unleashes each of our potentials, let's now reimagine. Let's now reimagine a world and a city where our workplaces are quite different. Our workplaces reflect the fact that we want to collaborate, that each of us may have an idea to start a company or to join a small company, that each of us may have an idea that needs some funding, and that funding no longer comes from the traditional places, but that we need an interface, a user interface for these kinds of cities that allow us to connect to sources of funding, that allow us to connect with each other, to find collaborators, to have spaces where we can work and learn together, to have spaces both in the formal setting of schools and outside that formal setting so that we can collaborate and have kids learn in this new way. So we can change the role of the teacher going from the lecturer to one of coach and facilitator, somebody who brings out the best in every kid and empowers each child to say, I can unleash my potential in this city. And so now when we look at the future, we think about a very different one. We think about one, let's just on the closing slide, we think about one that has the potential to empower each one of us, to empower those in communities, to empower community centers to be a place not just for recreation anymore, but for banking, a place for healthcare, a place for microenterprise, a place for mentorship, a place for learning. This kind of community center at the heart of the new kind of city is the kind of institution, the kind of interface that will help unleash the potential of each one of us. Thank you very much.